Thank you, Marge, for raising expectations and making this more difficult. Good evening. How are you doing? Good. Congratulations, graduates, on all your work to get you this far and preparing yourselves for service. Thank you to family for supporting them this far and bringing new educators and educational support specialists into the world. And thank you, grads, for investing your time and your energies and your talents in the future of young people. We're really looking forward to the fruits of your service in years to come. As I was thinking about this evening and what I should speak about after I was bribed with cheese to be the speaker for this evening, I thought of shoulder angels. And you know about shoulder angels, right? Shoulder angels is the term for those little characters that sit on people's left and right shoulders in movies when we need to portray some kind of moral conflict, right? The one on the right shoulder is the good angel. The one on the left shoulder is typically a devil who's whispering the wrong thing in your ear. Shoulder angels go back a long way in our culture, and in fact in a lot of world cultures. Shoulder angels go all the way back to pretty ancient Christian ideas of guardian angels, the idea of angels being assigned to watch over you, and there may be being somebody else looking over your other shoulder trying to make it difficult for your angel to hold it together. Textually, if we can go all the way back to a very early Christian book, a very popular Christian book of the 2nd century called The Shepherd of Hermas, talks about there being two angels with a man, one of righteousness and the other of iniquity. And so this idea of there being these two angels, one the voice of conscience and the other the voice of temptation, is a pretty old idea. If you trawl a little bit in popular culture, you'll find it cropping up pretty regularly in live-action movies, in animated movies. If you research a little further, you will find that superheroes have shoulder angels. You will find that shoulder angels can take the form of donuts. And research in animal intelligence is also revealing that even our pets have shoulder angels in appropriate form. So shoulder angels are a pretty common idea, and I was thinking about that this evening, and shoulder angels led me to Isaiah, as one might expect. Isaiah chapter 30, verses 20 to 21 says, "Although the Lord gives you the bread of adversity and the water of affliction, your teachers will be hidden no more. With your own eyes you will see them, whether you turn to the right or to the left. Your ears will hear a voice behind you saying, 'This is the way, walk in it.'" A couple of things are pretty interesting about this passage. One is context. Things are not going well. God's been giving Israel the bread of adversity, the water of affliction. Shorthand for lots of bad days. I guarantee that before you have been teaching for very long, you will have days that feel like the bread of adversity and the water of affliction. Sometimes quite a few of them in a row. And so this is part of the context. Things have not been going well. And yet, bigger passage here, it talks about God longing to be gracious to Israel. God wanting to come and do something good for these people who've been suffering under affliction and adversity. And the good comes in the form of teachers. And people who have more Hebrew than I do and write commentaries tell me that there's some ambiguity in that second line there, where it says, "Your teachers will be hidden no more." Some translations translate that, "Your teacher will be hidden no more," with a capital T. It could be singular, could be plural. You can't tell from the Hebrew. And so we could think of this as the blessing is that God won't be hiding anymore. God's going to come out into the open. He's going to make it clear what you're supposed to do. He's going to speak to you. You won't have to worry anymore about whether you're doing the right thing. And yet, other translations have this as your teachers, because, of course, often the way God comes and speaks to us is through the people that God gives us who speak truth to us and become the teachers who are not hidden from our eyes, who are right there physically in front of us, speaking God's will to us. And the second thing that's interesting here in this passage is that it's not quite shoulder angels, because you get God on both shoulders. It doesn't matter whether you turn to the right or to the left, you'll hear a voice saying, "This is the way, walk in it." This is the blessing, that it's not a tightrope. That you're not walking along thinking, do I listen to that voice? Do I listen to that voice? Should I eat the donut? Should I not eat the donut? That God's care for you will be sufficiently complete that it doesn't matter whether you listen out of your left ear or your right ear, you will hear a voice telling you what the right thing is to do. And if you know what the right thing is to do, you can get through the adversity and affliction. So I thought with the minutes I've got left this evening, I'd like to tell you about some of my shoulder angels. Because I do find that when I'm teaching, when I'm preparing class, when I'm writing about education, that very often I've got someone mentally sitting on my shoulder, whispering in my ear, someone who has been my teacher in the past, who's reminding me of things that I need to take into account, who's whispering to me about making sure I stay on the right path. So I'd like to introduce you to just a few of my teachers. Last night, I went searching through some old papers, and I found this letter. It was written by my supervising teacher during my student teaching semester. And it was sent to the university. It says he is not yet competent enough to be left in sole charge of a class's education. He needs to relate more directly to the pupils and to engage their attention by maintaining eye contact and showing real interest. This was probably fair. Certainly when I first began teaching, when I was doing my student teaching, I found it very difficult to get out of myself. I was afraid that it would go badly. I was afraid of what the students would think of me. I was consumed by all the headspace it took to figure out what I was supposed to be doing, and I was very much locked inside myself. I discovered why that didn't work one day when teaching French to 11-year-olds. I was standing at the blackboard, and I had a carefully worked out plan to teach some parts of French verbs. I'd figured it all out the night before, and I was busy transferring the notes from the paper through my head onto the blackboard so that they could transfer from the blackboard into the students' heads and onto the exam papers. That's education, right? And so for a couple of minutes, I was standing at the blackboard trying to get the endings right and trying to remember how to spell them properly and so on. And I spent 2 or 3 minutes standing facing the blackboard and failing to turn around and engage eye contact with my students. When I turned round again, the whole class's attention was oddly centered on a spot in the front row where one of my students, whom I will call Wayne, all the names that I shall use will be pseudonyms, one of my students, Wayne, had decided to take his clothes off to see what I would do. And one of my thoughts at this moment was that I could not remember any moment in my teacher education when I'd been prepared for this precise moment in class. So know that as of now, you are slightly better prepared than I was when I went out into school, because we have now covered this situation when the student undresses in class while you're writing on the board. What I actually did was I laughed. I asked him to go outside and put his clothes on and then come back in and learn French, which I still think was probably the right thing to do. But the thing that Wayne taught me in that moment, or helped me to begin to learn, is that teaching is not just about me getting my plan straight and then performing it in front of students. That if I can't find some way of becoming involved with my students in the learning that's going on, there will be no end to the creativity they invest in finding other things to do with the time. So Wayne is one of my shoulder angels. A year or so later, I was in my first teaching job. I was a little more competent. Apparently somebody had thought I could be left in sole charge of a class. And I'd been teaching a particular class of 15, 16-year-olds, teaching them French for the year, and we got to the end of the year and they had speaking tests, and each student had to come to my office one-on-one and speak foreign language and have it recorded and sent away to the examining board to be graded. Not at all intimidating. And so I sat there opposite one of my students, we'll call him James, and I sat there looking at this student, and I suddenly realized that I'd never seen him before. Now, I'd seen him every day. He'd been in my class for an entire year. I could pick him out of a crowd. I knew what his name was. I'd called on him in class. But have you ever noticed that difference between people who are just part of your environment, right? People you can recognize, you know who they are. And when you've actually sat down opposite someone and actually tried to see them, when you've seen the slight asymmetries in their face and the slight anxiety at the corners of their eyes and the cast of their mouth, and caught a sense of who they are. And I sat looking at James and I thought, this student has been in my classroom for a year and I've never seen him before. And that scared me. And he changed the way I thought about preparing for class. I thought, I have to find ways of building in space and strategies and time where I actually have enough time to see my students, to see who's there, to recognize them, to recognize that they're here. So James became another of my shoulder angels. Susan was a 12-year-old in another of my French classes. I think this was about a year later. I was teaching some part of French grammar. A little nervous because I still didn't have a perfect mastery of French grammar, and when she raised her hand, it evoked my fears of being a new teacher and having to know the right answer because the teacher's supposed to know everything. And I thought, what if she asks me about the subjunctive? And so I kind of wandered over, and with some trepidation, and when I got to her desk, she put her hand down and she said, "Sir, are you afraid of dying?" This was another moment that I couldn't remember from the textbook. And I don't remember what I said. I said something. And then her friend who was sitting next to her piped up. She said, We talk about it all the time. 12-year-olds in French. And that conversation had a big impact on me because it really brought home to me how the students in my classroom were not playing along with the game of forgetting to be human beings for an hour so that we could just concentrate on French grammar. They were not leaving their spirits, their big questions, their doubts, their faith, their fears outside the door so that they could purely concentrate on my agenda of learning French. And here was I teaching a foreign language curriculum that seemed to be mostly about buying Cokes in other countries and checking into hotels and buying train tickets. And I thought, how is this helping? And this started to change the way I designed my syllabus. I started to ask, how do I teach in a way that might make sense to someone who's 12 and afraid of dying? What would have to be part of my class? That question stayed with me for the last 25 years. So she became one of my shoulder angels. Rachel was not a very good student academically. She didn't have real good concentration. She was often up and out of her seat and wandering around. Found it pretty hard to focus on things. One day it had been her birthday, and she'd been given as a gift a nice set of personalized stationery with her name on it and a floral border. And she had brought this to class with her. And during my class, while I was helping other students, they were doing group work, she had stood up and wandered off. While she was gone, a boy sitting in the row behind her leant over, took her pen, and wrote something like, "Rachel is a stupid cow," on the top sheet of her birthday stationery. She came back to her desk and melted down. And suddenly I had a very loud, very messy, very liquid emotional event going on in my classroom. It wasn't too hard to figure out who did it. I had a handwriting sample. So I calmed Rachel down enough that she could function again and assured her that something would happen, and while I was still furiously thinking about what might happen. And I asked Mike, the boy from the row behind, to step outside the room for a moment while I decided what to say to him. And so I got the rest of the class working, got them all focused on what they were doing, and when it seemed like a safe moment, I stepped outside. Now, Mike, by this point, was leaning against the wall, arms folded, bottom lip protruding, gaze fixed sternly on the floor. His body language was saying to me, "I know you're going to tell me off, and you're not going to win." So I stood in front of him and said nothing, which he found disconcerting. He started to fidget. Eventually, he gave in and he looked up. Once I had eye contact, I said to him, "Mike, if you come into my classroom, you come into class and sometimes stuff gets broken, like you swing back on your chair and the leg breaks off the chair, or you scratch your initials into the desk or something, or a window gets broken. You know what happens. The school disciplinary procedures kick in, right? You might get a detention, or you have to pay for something, or you have to go talk to somebody. But you know what? None of that stuff really matters that much. You know why? Because you come into my classroom and break a chair, I can take that classroom down to the workshop, they'll weld it back together, it'll be back up here in 2 days, there'll be somebody sitting on it again, and we'll forget about it. So if you come into my classroom and you break a person, where do I send them to get them fixed?" And to my astonishment, he burst into tears, rolling down his cheeks. And I waited a moment and I said, when you've got your face back together, when you think you're ready to come back into the room with us, I'd like you to come back in and figure out a way to make this right with Rachel so that we can carry on learning together. And I'll check in with you at the end of class to find out if you still need help figuring out how to do that. And he came back in, and we figured it out. I still think that might be one of those rare days when maybe I did the right thing. But what Mike and Rachel made me think about long and hard that day, and often since, was that every time I walk into a classroom, every time I react to what someone does in a classroom, every time I decide whether to shout or be silent, whether to call for the detention book or ask a question, every time I interact in a classroom, I'm explicitly or implicitly teaching my students what a human being is, what it is to relate to one another, what community is, how we're supposed to treat one another, who we're supposed to be. I am never just teaching French or mathematics or history or science. It's not the way it works. And so Rachel and Mike became shoulder angels. Finally, Chris was at a big urban school that I was at for just a few months while I was doing grad studies, and they weren't able to quite fill my timetable with foreign languages, which was what I taught, so they gave me an hour a week with 2 students who really needed help with their reading. They were quite some way behind and were struggling. One of them was Chris. Chris looked out at the world from below perpetually furrowed brows and had this constantly slightly hunted expression, always looked a little serious and concerned. We met, and I was trying to help him with his reading. The second time we met, the second week of the semester, Chris told me I was his favorite teacher. I said, Chris, that's silly. I cannot be your favorite teacher. I've met you twice. He said, no, you're the only teacher who doesn't shout at me. I started to follow Chris around the school. It was a large school. It was complex. I got lost sometimes. He often wasn't quite sure what class he was supposed to be in next. He would be trying to find the right group of kids to follow. So he would often arrive a minute or two late to class, by which time the rest of the class was settling and the teacher was getting going with the teacher's agenda. And so he would get a word from the teacher about being disruptive and settling down. He would start rummaging in his bag and trying to figure out which books he needed and which class he was in and what things went together. And of course, at this point, the teacher was giving instructions and he was missing them. So when the rest of the students started working on the task, he would just about have got his books onto the desk and he'd be turning, asking the student next to him what he was supposed to be doing. And by this time, some of the teachers were getting impatient and were giving him a stern word, or even in some cases, it would escalate where they would send him out of the room to get the detention book and he would miss another 10, 15 minutes of instruction. And I watched this child spiraling down in this school that was supposed to be helping him grow. One of the things Chris taught me is that schools can be evil. That there are people in schools who are not being helped. But also that when I'm teaching, it's so easy to see the students, especially when I'm tired, the students in my classroom as obstacles on the path to my great life as a teacher. Obstacles to getting it done, obstacles to covering stuff, obstacles to being efficient, obstacles to getting the exam scores up. And Chris told me to listen especially for the students who are drowning, for the ones who really aren't being helped right now. Chris is one of my shoulder angels. Although the Lord gives you the bread of adversity and the water of affliction, you'll see adversity and affliction in schools. Your teachers will be hidden no more. They'll be right there in front of you. Some of them will be failing your tests. Some of them will be misbehaving in your classes. With your own eyes, you'll see them. And whether you turn to the right or the left, if you pay attention to your students, you'll hear through them a still small voice that says, care for me, have compassion on me, love your neighbor right here in front of you. This is the way. Walk in it. May you be blessed with many shoulder angels. May you listen to them carefully. Thank you for listening.